Hi, I'm Keith Johnston, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, we're joined by Vice President and Principal Analyst David Trogue and Principal Analyst Pete Jacques to discuss why customer experience scores have reached new lows in the U.S. and how companies can actually turn these things around. Welcome, David. Welcome, Pete.
Hi, Keith. Hi, Pete. Great to be here this morning.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having us.
So guys, we can jump right into it. At the heart of this is all about our CX index, our flagship customer experience index. Basically, consumer perceptions of CX quality in the US dropped 3 years in a row, but they have been dropping with the exception of the pandemic year in 2021, where brands seem to be putting everything they could towards their customers to make sure that, number one, they don't lose them, but number two, that they continue to spend through that unprecedented time. Maybe you can just refresh us what the CX index score actually is, and maybe perhaps just a little bit of how it works in measuring these perceptions.
Sure. So the CX index is a measure of quality. It's really telling us how well companies deliver customer experiences that build and maintain loyalty. So the three components of the CX index score are effectiveness, ease, and emotion. So effectiveness is how well did the brand do at meeting customers' needs. Ease is how easy was it to work with them. And emotion was how did that experience make you feel? And in our research, we've identified that those three components, again, what we call the three E's, are some of the top ones that are predictive of loyalty behaviors that many companies seek. So are you willing to stay with the company? Are you willing to buy more products and services, which is enrichment? And are you willing to advocate or speak positively about the business, recommend it to your friends and families? So that measure, again, is a measure of how well the quality of the experience is, which then impacts and is best predictive of loyalty behaviors. So the score is based on a 100-point scale. And for the U.S., we survey over 98,000 people this year. Roughly, we're looking for close to 100,000 that we survey each year. And we cover 223 brands across 13 industries. So it really is a broad view of the marketplace in the United States.
And so across 223 brands, 13 industries, that's a lot of range. So David, maybe you can just talk about, we are at an all-time low, but it's not one industry, it's many industries. It's a lot of brands in there. How bad are we talking? What's going on here?
It's really bad. I mean, not just 3 years in a row, but the lowest point ever. And, this year the score was 69.3 out of 100, whereas last year it was 70.9. Now, that's a difference of 1.6, and that may not sound like a lot, but it's actually a big deal because just a single point can really make a huge difference when you multiply that by, customers and revenue per customer, et cetera. So those small drops make a big difference. So the fact that it is at its lowest point ever in the history of the CX index is a big deal. So scores declined in 10 of the 13 industries and improved in only one, and that industry was airlines. And interestingly, this year, just like last year, most of the companies were in the okay category, right in the middle there, kind of a bell curve. So not as many fell into the good category and more fell into the poor category than last year. Now, this isn't all bad. Most of the shift, though, is from the positive to the neutral. The negative has remained pretty much consistent.
So Pete, I know that we're going to get into this in more detail, but just so we have a little contrast, because it's sometimes hard to visualize, what's inside that 100-point score? We had a moment in 2021 where things went up, and here we are where all industries are down. Is there contrast there that we can kind of orient ourselves to the CX index?
I think if I had to encapsulate it into kind of one major theme, it would be that companies have shifted their focus from an external to an internal, and not in a good way. So in the height of the pandemic, companies were doing a lot to stay relevant and be able to meet customers where they wanted to be met and where they could be met given the restrictions. And it really raised consumer expectations of what companies could do to meet their needs and do that effectively. And since we've come out of the pandemic, a lot of companies have forgotten about that and have shifted away from there. And some parts because of, we ran into inflation, we ran into supply chain issues, number of factors. But that trend has continued, and consumer expectations of how they want to meet with brands hasn't changed, hasn't increased dramatically. It's maintained where it was from the pandemic, but companies have continued to shift away from that as they've focused on different things. And you'll see this come up again in some of the more specific themes that we've identified and we'll talk about, not just from CX, but EX as well, for example.
I appreciate you orienting us in it all. All right, let's just look at the present. Here we are in this moment. We thought that supply chain issues were behind us, all the effort that went into, new technologies and experiences, all that stuff in the pandemic. It all happened. We're 3 years removed. So orient us right now. Like you talked about consumer reporting, steeper drops in brands' effectiveness. You talked about, misaligned expectations. What is going on right here in 2024?
So what we're seeing, for example, from the data perspective and from a quality perspective, is that consumers are basically telling us that it's harder to get their needs met and it's harder to work with brands than it was in the past. So at that high level, again, the way that companies are engaging with consumers is making it more difficult for consumers. One of the things we'll get into, Keith, and you'll see this, is that some of these underlying factors that we're exploring and identifying move outside of what specifically a company or a brand can control. There are marketplace issues at play here. But I think the way companies are responding and reacting to them is telling. When we look, for example, like as we do the analysis and understand what's driving the scores, the CX index score and these three quality metrics, we also look at what we call key drivers, so specific attributes of brands that are predictive of better CX scores. And we find commonalities across a number of industries. For example, the ability to resolve problems and issues quickly or the first time is a common top driver for many companies across many industries. Maybe not for all of them, but again, it's very, very common across many of them. And we're seeing performance on a driver like that decrease. Another one is communicates using plain language. So again, these are high-level attributes, but they're giving us a little bit of line of sight into where companies are not doing as well as they used to, or as well as what consumers expect them to do in this environment. So again, some of that might have been raised during the pandemic when companies really stepped up, and maybe now they're drawing back on the attention to some of those drivers. But that's part of what's driving this change in perception is companies need to keep doing well. Or if there are these marketplace issues that are going on, that's impacting things, inflation, for example, they need to be able to communicate effectively with consumers to help them understand, some of the decisions they're making, either in their pricing or services that are being offered. And we see that reflected in the loyalty intentions. So, and this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. As part of that model, as I mentioned earlier, the better that companies perform on those quality metrics, the higher we see intentions to be loyal. And we're seeing those intentions dropping now from a real positive intent to more of a neutral, consumers basically telling us they're not sure if they're going to stay with the company or if they're going to buy additional products and services. So again, there's a real impact to a company's bottom line if these trends continue.
You mentioned inflation, which brings me to, wondering, is this all consumers? Is there a difference between low, middle, and high income consumers?
Yeah, we're able to do a little bit of analysis with the data that we capture in here. And what we're finding is that among middle market consumers, those probably in the higher end of the bracket, we're probably talking roughly, $75,000 to $100,000 in annual income. We're seeing more of an impact in that group in terms of their perceptions of the experience, the quality of the experience, and their intentions. And what we also did is looked at a number of external marketplace factors, such as consumer confidence, the average increases in salary, savings rates, things like that. And we found a correlation among that group that indicates to us that In the past, that group's been kind of in a comfortable place. They've made enough money that they've been able to keep doing what they've wanted to do. They've been able to, if I can say, have the avocado toast for breakfast, for example. But now they're finally seeing themselves squeezed. So as a comparison, lower income households have always been in this squeeze where they're just not able to do what they wanted to. They've been restricted in what they can spend, what they can buy, what they're able to do. And obviously more affluent households are not feeling the squeeze. But for the first time, this slightly more affluent group is feeling that squeeze. Maybe some of the household members have lost jobs. They've depleted their savings rates, their savings that they've built up during the pandemic. We're seeing a lot more households. We're seeing the debt rate increase. And so this is a group now that's feeling pain that they haven't felt before. And as we extend that into thinking about what's happening in the marketplace, what we're seeing is basically a loss in the perceived value that consumers are having. And this now starts broadening out further beyond this income group. But again, it's more salient for this higher income group because they haven't had this issue before. They haven't felt this pain. Now they're asking themselves, I'm paying more for, say, the same basket of groceries or for services that I've had before, but I'm not seeing the additional value that's associated with it. I'm not seeing better service, a higher quality product. So again, now that's being translated into how they're perceiving the quality of the product and the service that they're receiving.
But it also goes beyond, it's easy to quantify quantity and price and perhaps a feature, but the CX index goes a little bit deeper, right?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly look at a number of different aspects of the experience. And I think, another way to think about this is, consumers can potentially draw four different types of value from their exchange. What we're talking primarily about now is the economic value. Am I getting a good exchange for what I'm paying for? And as that equation shifts, as prices go up, consumers now are asking themselves probably a couple questions. One is, am I continuing to get the value that I expect? Is this equivalent? Is there kind of par or balance here? And if not, I either decide to switch somewhere else, or how else can I get value from that exchange? And that could be functional value. Is this product that I'm getting, the service that I'm getting, helping me get done what I need to get done better than it was before, better than another consumer, than another firm? Is there symbolic value? Is there something about this that makes me feel better about myself? Worth, more belongingness? Is there something in that exchange that feels better for me? And then the last is experiential. I'm paying more or perhaps paying the same. Am I getting a better experience in that exchange than I was before as prices go up or as I compare to other firms? So I think part of this equation is if companies are thinking about or have had to shift prices up or potentially decrease maybe the physical aspect of the product, how else can they bring value into that equation that will keep consumers with them and thinking positively about them?
I would just add that, some of those things that Pete was just mentioning, like a sense of belonging or even, convenience and usefulness, some of those things are a little harder to quantify than just, cost for the consumer. And as a result, it can be a little bit of a challenge for companies to commit to focusing on those because they're perceived as soft, when really what soft means there is just, harder to analyze. They're a little deeper. They're a little more complex. And so I think it's really important to steer away from let's focus on the simple metric and try to focus on some of those things that are more complex, that are a little deeper, because they really do make a difference in the perceptions of consumers in the experiences they have with brands.
Yeah, well stated. And, it's when you can't see it so obviously, you understand it's probably hard work, to raise those levers. But, brand matters, perception matters. So let's get deeper into the root causes. And David, I'm going to stay with you for a minute because there's one linkage between 21 and 24. 21, we were literally trying to accelerate out of the pandemic, and we had a massive boom in technology spending. That's very tangible. We know that in 22 and 23, people incurred a lot of, tech debt. They tried to, had to refactor a lot of, systems to kind of reconcile all those investments. But in 2024, technology spending, again, is the one thing that's not going down. And it's actually accelerating. And now we had this AI thing with Gen AI, and it probably got a boon through these last, couple years. So, given all of that investment, we've had, an acceleration of some really interesting technologies that should impact customer experiences. Talk about one of those root causes that you discovered in the CX index and some of the technologies that should be helping customer experiences but may not be delivering.
One of the things that we think is happening is that the biggest digital experience investment trend of the past decade has mostly failed. Historically, digital experience has been about using apps and websites, clicking, hunting around on through buttons and menus. But conversational experiences have really become a big part of what companies are investing in. In fact, 67% of US firms have invested in chatbots. But what's really interesting is that they're not successful with consumers. 58% of consumers have actually tried them. So that's encouraging and understandable because they're drawn to be able to interact using ordinary language the way we are now, right? This is attractive for humans to interacting with companies, with brands. But although 58% have tried them, only 16% actually turn to chatbots regularly for help. So there's a real mismatch there between, companies investing heavily, and that's been growing over the past 10 years, but consumers having tried them because they're attracted to them, but not actually liking them, hence the only 16% using them regularly. Now, what's happened in the past year that's made a big difference with Gen AI that you were alluding to, Keith, is that, of course, ChatGPT came out in November at the end of 2022, and then there have been a lot of imitators since then. And so starting with a situation where already consumers were pretty disappointed with the state of these conversational interfaces and of chatbots, suddenly there's a chatbot that seems very fluent, that seems a lot better than those that existed. And so that makes the existing disappointment even worse in comparison. So, the investment and excitement about generative AI in some ways has actually made customer experience perceptions worse when it comes to conversational interfaces because those established chatbots that consumers are dealing with are just mostly deterministic chatbots, the kind that you deal with your bank or your insurance company or retailer. There's not a lot of Gen AI in them, if any at all, much anywhere. So there's a big difference between those established chatbots and what's going on with Gen AI that's resulting in, we think, real downward pressure on those scores this year.
Pete, another factor, or actually perhaps there's a couple of root causes that you discovered that are also linked. And so, when there's economic challenges, when there's instability in the markets, leaders have to make decisions on what to invest in. And here we are. You may have prioritized one way in 21, which was an up year, but here, year after year since, we may be prioritizing other ways. Is there a root cause within our leadership? Is it all about the economics of doing business now or the economy? What's some of the factors there?
So we could probably narrow that down into two areas, one a bit more specific than the other. I'll start with a broader one, and that's customer obsession. And I start there because in our most recent work, we see 81% of companies reporting back that they are customer obsessed. But when we look at the evaluation of their responses to our assessment, it's actually only about 3% that are truly doing those things that would qualify them as being customer obsessed. So there's a couple factors I think that play into there. One is that leaders are not being, honest with themselves or taking a real true assessment of how much they're really focusing on being customer obsessed. And part of that is really putting the customer at the center of their leadership, their strategy, their operations. And that doesn't mean that, doing whatever the customer wants, but it's taking that customer viewpoint and perspective into consideration. So I think a lot of companies are perhaps withdrawing or pulling back on their efforts to become customer obsessed, either because they think they're already there when they're not, or they're realizing how much work it really takes. And it does take a lot of work because, as I mentioned, it's a change in culture. It's a change in an overall perspective on how you run your business. And oftentimes, we've heard anecdotally from customers, from our clients that we've talked to, that report, boy, this is a lot harder than we thought it would be, or it's taking longer to see results. And so getting back to your point is, as they're looking at where to cut costs, unfortunately, CX, customer obsession, becomes an easy target because there's longer term ROI on a realization of ROI on those factors. And leaders are now kind of taking that shorter term view and saying, well, I'm not seeing impact. We're seeing our scores decline. So, is what we're doing really even worthwhile? So let's move those resources and realign that budget to something else, which it kind of, really is the wrong thing to do if you're really focused on trying to improve your experiences and your customer obsession. So there's that higher level view of leaders either, saying that they are and not practicing what they preach, or not having a really good perception of what it takes in order to become customer obsessed and get to those better and higher CX quality scores. The other angle is more specifically on EX. And we actually saw this coming last year in our EX predictions, what we're calling an EX winter, that there was a weakening commitment to EX investment. Employers taking their eye off the ball. We're seeing return to work initiatives, for example, that may not have been well thought out, that are leading to more disengaged employees. We're seeing preemptive layoffs to deal with a recession that hasn't come yet. So that's impacting employee experiences. And focuses on investments in EX are focused more on software that's improving, say, HR capital management efficiency, rather than on the employees themselves and helping them get the tools and the services they need to do their jobs more effectively and to be more engaged. So there is that shift there as well, that in a way is probably related, that how much do we really need to focus on EX? Can we divert these funds to something else in order to get us through these current difficult and challenging economic times? And the last thing I'll mention too is, we're starting to see a shift in the support to DEI investments. It's atrophying. Again, our surveys are showing a decreasing level of commitment of resources committed to supporting diversity efforts. And that's impacting employee engagement, employee perceptions of their companies as well.
It's interesting that all three of those that you've mentioned, or three of the things you mentioned, customer obsession, EX, and DEI, are all long-term commitments that are required. And what's going on is kind of a thrashing, like, well, we're not seeing immediate results, and so we're cutting back, which is really a misunderstanding of the time horizon that's required in terms of committing to those goals.
Yeah, but it is fascinating, David. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about this. Is that, here, this whole idea of the perception of value or what to invest in and all these things, they all have some sort of economic situation, whether it be margin compression or cutting cost or what have you. So you're pulling back and, laying off people. That's an easy cost cutting measure. Investing less in EX, that's probably another one, even though that we know through all of our data that, the perception, an employee's perception of what's a good investment or whether they're being cared for, and the leaders, there's always a difference there. In the end, all of these things seem to be really putting pressure on what is value. And it's feeding the dissatisfaction of the consumer. Can you just wrap a bow around all these economic pressures for us and what the CX index specifically says about those factors?
I think, Keith, your comment on values, certainly the sense of value is much broader than cost, for sure. And one of the important things to keep in mind that I think a lot of brands lose sight of is that brands actually cannot create value. Value is a perception in the eyes of the consumer. And that's a really, really big deal. Now, there are two separate things here. There's creation of value and values. And there is this issue of misaligned values. So there are a lot fewer consumers responding to our study who feel that the values of their favorite brands really align with their own. In 2021, it was 49%, which was the highest level ever. And it dropped to 43% in 2024. And trust has dropped also. And customers' willingness to forgive mistakes made by a brand has reversed course. That's the first time after a steady climb that began in 2018. That's worrisome. And, we do research asking consumers for specifically how they feel about these issues. And I just want to mention a couple of verbatim quotes from respondents that I think are interesting here. One male, 39, US, who said, "I'm not a fan when brands inject themselves into modern politics or start leaning toward a political side." So if a brand decides it wants to make a political statement, I make one myself. I stop using their product. Another one, female 65, said, I no longer am buying brands that keep coming out with their political agendas. Just make your product and quit the stupid advertising, she says. So that's interesting coming from consumers. And I think is maybe some hints at an overemphasis in some ways on brands getting a little bit outside the values that are actually aligned with what they deliver and what their products and services are.
And if I can just build on that a little bit, I think what companies need to do more of is to really work to understand what it is that their customers want, what they need. Again, not to impose upon their customers, here's a value we think you want or need, but to really understand, and especially among their core customers, what we call devotees, what is it that you are looking for? How do you get value from us? And let's make sure we're aligned there.
All right. So, gentlemen, we need to figure out how to turn this around. As you're talking to our clients, is there those 1 to 3, maybe even 5 things that they should absolutely do right now to turn around their CX index scores?
In essence, it's kind of like stop doing what we're telling you or what we've mentioned that you're doing right now. So one of the things around customer obsession, I'll say, is to be realistic. Look in the mirror, think about where are you really along that continuum? Where do you want to be? And really work to put the customer in the center of how you run your business. It's not going to do any good to just talk a good story. You need to walk the talk. And you need to, as an organization, think about what that looks like. It's not going to be just an initiative or a short-term solution. It's a cultural change. It's a process change. So there is a lot of work involved. And if you truly want to improve the quality of your experiences, improve your CX score, and obviously then improve business outcomes, you need to take a serious look at where you are now, where you want to be, and what that means as an organization that you need to change.
And we should point out that not all of this costs money, right? Yeah, some of this is just a mindset shift that actually can be good for business.
Absolutely. Along the same lines is, again, reshifting and starting to invest again in EX. We certainly see a lot of the connections between CX and EX. We need to think about what are those investments that we can make beyond just the software that supports capital management. But, how can we help employees do their job better? How do we listen more? And this is, moving beyond just doing an annual pulse survey of employee experiences, maybe taking a similar approach that we do for our customers and setting up multiple listening posts to really understand what are the concerns of your employees and how can we act on them. And like you said, Keith, they may not all require a huge investment, but certainly understanding what's driving that lower employee engagement is a starting point. And then the last thing I'll mention there, because we are talking about the CX index score, is to build the right bridges, find the right method of collaboration, the right collaboration strategy that best fits your organization to bring EX and CX more closely together to really help you understand how do we improve our CX scores by also improving the engagement and the involvement of our employees. These don't need to be siloed. That's the most important thing. But how the two teams work together can look differently. And we have some great research from Angelina Genis that talks about different ways those two teams can work together.
So I would add to what Pete just said a couple of things. First of all, in response to this dissatisfaction that consumers have with conversational experiences, which, it may seem tactical, but this is really a 10-year trend and of companies investing and being bad and not satisfactory. That's not because chatbots are inherently going to be a problem. We're very bullish on their potential long term, but companies need a different approach. And one of those things is to involve experts in design and not treat chatbot efforts as purely IT projects. We've interviewed company after company about their efforts, and they've recognized again and again that is one of the big mistakes they've made. It's just, allocating IT resources and neglecting the fact that this is an experience the consumer is having. And it's not just about, superficial understanding of design, the typeface and the color of the bubbles or something like that, but conversation design, interaction design. And that's a really, really important part of this. Another one is starting to weave in Gen AI, or planning to at least, and experimenting and piloting. to make sure that your customer obsession efforts are focused on individuals, not segments. GenAI starts to make that possible, starts to make that potentially scalable in a way that it wasn't previously. And then the final thing I'll say about this one is to really allocate GenAI resources to your best customers first. One of the sort of dirty secrets of GenAI is that it's really expensive. I don't mean in dollars right now because technology companies are making it available for free for the most part, but computationally it's very expensive. And so that's going to come home to roost probably in 2025 is what I'm hearing from a lot of companies when they're saying they're going to start charging for what they're now giving away for free. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to have to choose who you allocate those resources to and make sure that when you're doing those fancy new personalization things, you don't just do them blanket for all of your customers. You probably can't afford to. It would be nice if you could, but you probably can't. So you want to prioritize your best customers, your devotees, and those with the highest customer lifetime value. The other thing I would say is that, we touched on this a little earlier, but I want to go back to really realigning your value proposition to the needs of your customers. And we talked about understanding their values, exploring how you can do more than focus on economic value. Of course, again, there's that values and value, but they actually are related, closely related, although they're different things. Really get a deeper understanding of your devotees, who Pete referred to a moment ago, and make sure that you're recognizing and planning for that rise of value-based consumers. This is one of the big things that is happening. Social value-driven consumers are a big trend, but there's this social divisiveness that can be a problem, as those two quotes I mentioned earlier illustrated. And so there's kind of a walking a fine line between going too far on that and not doing anything about it at all. And that requires a lot of critical thinking about where to align with customer values, but also making sure that these are genuinely aligned with the company's values and relevant to its products and services. And then the last thing I'll mention is accelerating time to market through really comprehensive customer understanding. And that may sound surprising because there's kind of this myth that actually investing in research and understanding customers slows time to market. But in reality, it actually accelerates time to success because, just getting something to market quick and cheap, if it ends up not being effective and not satisfying customers, it's going to sink like a rock. It's much better to, in fact, invest in the research required to understand customer needs, understand their values, understand their aspirations and their goals, so that you can get something to market that really meets their needs and is successful and effective for your company.
Thank you, Pete and David. This is all very practical advice. I'm not so sure that this is going to be the year that our CX index scores are going to increase because it feels like a pretty dynamic time, but we're going to do our best. Appreciate all the advice, and we look forward to talking about this next year. See how we've improved.
Sounds good.
Yeah. And I think, it's important to not let consumers' low perceptions of CX right now discourage you as a brand. I think in some ways, on the contrary, in the middle of a slump, it means there's really no better time to differentiate from competitors since so many have sunk to historic lows. So this is the time to really buckle down and seize the opportunity to make it much better and to stand out from the crowd.
Well, that might be the best advice yet. Thank you, David.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.